voice that matters is the voice of the jury, and the jury has spoken.
Just minutes ago, the Manhattan DA spoke to the media for the first time since a New York jury reached a historic verdict this afternoon in former President Donald Trump's so-called hush money criminal trial. Trump was found guilty on all 34 felony counts. He is now the first former U.S. president to be convicted of felony crimes. It's a decision the former president is blasting, calling it rigged and a disgrace. Here now to break down the verdict and what comes next is legal and political analyst Wendy Patrick. Thanks for being with us,
Thank you.
Patrick, on such short notice. First, let's just acknowledge that statement first. He's called it rigged and a disgrace. Watching how this legal process played out, is that a fair description of what we saw take place?
Well, what we saw take place is the jury doing what they do. This was a jury box not filled with fans, but fact finders. So their role was very different than perhaps the role of the American public in the voting system. Is they were exposed to a closed universe of information, and it was on that basis that they went in the back and, boy, it came to a pretty swift decision by all accounts. But I think what the president is saying, what the former president is saying, he's complained about the system in general for a very long time, and he's made the same statements about all four criminal proceedings. Now, of course, that only leaves 3 of them, although he'll no doubt appeal this one.
Sure.
But the jurors apparently, did what they needed to do, and we don't get to know what they discussed in the jury deliberation room unless they decide to come forward and share that with us.
Which would seem unlikely in this particular case, given our political climate. I don't know that many of them would want to put themselves out there for that.
That's right.
Is there anything particular that jumped out at you about this? Maybe the fact the jury came back so quickly, or the fact that it was all 34 counts he was found guilty of?
Well, they either had to decide that they had the legal wherewithal to be able to make that finding, or they didn't. So it's not surprising if it was a guilty verdict on 1 count that it would be guilty on all 34 counts. What I think was more surprising is the extent to which everybody underestimated the strength of this case.
Right.
Remember, it was so complicated. Sometimes I feel like we underestimate jurors, that they can't put facts and do the legal analysis, and whether or not there were 2 lawyers on that jury. They apparently didn't find it as difficult as everybody thought they would to take the facts, to plug it into what, by all accounts, was a complicated set of instructions. And they were able to do that quickly. That, I think, is probably the biggest takeaway.
One last thing on the legal front I want to ask is, Donald Trump obviously is going to appeal. Did anything jump out at you as possible grounds for an appeal? Does he have a good pathway anywhere?
Well, they always have to make all the grounds that they can. Perhaps one of the very foundational pathways would be the way the counts were structured. But I don't know whether or not that would be the type of thing that would be successful on appeal, rather than, well, the judge shouldn't have let in this, that, or the other types of evidence. One thing I will say, though, is that right now we pivot from that judge being the impartial umpire of calling balls and strikes to the fact that he actually gets to weigh in now at the sentencing.
That's
one thing
deal.
He's going to take into consideration, in addition to the fact that obviously Donald Trump has no former record, is he's also not remorseful. He says he didn't do it. And that is the kind of thing, all of those factors that he can consider in deciding now what's the sentence going to be.
All right, you said pivot, let's pivot. You also do political analysis for us. First and foremost, is this going to matter? Is this going to change anything in the November election?
If the voters' own voices are any indication, the answer would be very little. Most Republicans have said they would still vote for the president. Remember, of the 4 criminal cases that he's facing, this was the least serious. And it's also true that he can, obviously we know this, he can run for president, he can serve as president. Whether or not somebody's convicted of a felony isn't among the prerequisites to be president. But the fate of this case is going to be tied up in appeals come November. So whether or not there are those Republicans that say, well, if he were convicted and if it were a final judgment, I probably wouldn't vote for him, even those folks won't have that final decision, if you will, come November. So it probably won't have that kind of political ramifications.
But in as narrow as an election as it could be, it's hard to say. It'll be really interesting to see what those results are and what the exit polls say about why people made their choices. Last thing, only a little bit more time. Is a conviction actually a good thing for a Trump campaign? I mean, they sent out the fundraising emails immediately after the conviction was announced. And to be fair, the Biden campaign did as well. But is this a good thing for him?
You and I are on the same wavelength. I was trying to work that in. Absolutely. There are some that believe that not only was he charged, but the fact that he was convicted would also be something to fundraise on. In the same fashion that every time those indictments came down last year, his fundraising numbers went up. Remember that?
Yep.
So who's to say that this conviction won't also raise those numbers? Which, by the way, might be a good thing. But if you're Donald Trump, you saw it on his face today. This was not a good day for the former president.
No.
As much as he can talk his talk, this was tough for him and tough for his family. We saw that after the verdict.
Yeah, people could argue it wasn't a great day for America
No,
either, seeing a
and they
former
are
president
arguing that.
being
That's right.
convicted of a felony. Wendy Patrick, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
We'll talk again at the 6 o'clock
Yes,
hour.
we will.
We look forward to that. For now, I'm going to send it back over to Shannon.